With this video, we're going to look at the anatomy of the kidneys. So we're going to start with some gross anatomy, things that are visible to the naked eye, and then we're going to finish up talking about the microscopic anatomy of kidneys. If you look at this diagram here, we have a kidney that has been cut longitudinally, so you can see the internal structure of it. And one of the things that you'll notice as you look at it, probably the first thing you'll notice, is there's a lot of blood vessels within the kidneys. So the kidneys are very, very vascular. Actually, they receive about a quarter of cardiac output each minute. So 25% of the blood that's being pumped by the heart goes directly to the kidneys. And of course, the reason for that is the kidneys are the organs that are filtering the blood, removing things that are found in excess from the blood, toxins, those kinds of things, and releasing them into the urine so that they can exit the body. If you look at this picture over here, this is the medial aspect of the kidney. So this area over here where I'm running my pointer along, and you'll notice we have a very large artery, the renal artery that enters the kidney on this side. And we also have a very large vein, so the renal vein that exits the kidney there. What happens when blood enters the kidneys is it travels through this renal artery and then it moves through a series of blood vessels out to what's known as the cortex of the kidneys. If you look at this outermost portion of the kidneys where we've got a lot of small blood vessels, this is an area which is known as the cortex, and it's worth mentioning because it's within the cortex that we have the microscopic structures that filter the blood and from that produce urine. There's a little anatomical landmark that I want to point out to you as we're looking at this diagram of the kidneys. Notice there's an artery and a vein, so one represented in blue, the other one in red, that sits out here and it has kind of an arcing shape to it. This is what's known as the arcuate artery and the arcuate vein, and they form the boundary between the cortex, which I mentioned previously, which is that area where we have those structures that are responsible for filtering the blood and from that producing urine, and the medulla, which is this more middle portion, inner area of the kidney itself. With the next slide, what we're going to do is actually look at the microscopic structures that are found within the cortex that are responsible for filtering the blood and from that producing urine. So I want you to take one more look at kind of this boundary vessel here, this arcuate artery and vein, because we're going to use that to kind of guide what we're looking at with the next slide. Remember that arcuate artery and vein is at the junction, it forms the boundary between the cortex, where our structures that filter the urine are, and the medulla, where other structures of the kidney are located. So if you look at this picture here, I want you to focus for just a minute on this kidney that's over here on the far left side. Once again, it's been cut longitudinally so that you can see the internal structures. A lot of blood vessels are present. And the artist has taken just a small little square section of this kidney and magnified it much more highly so that you can see the microscopic structures that are found here at the boundary between the cortex and the medulla. So here's that arcuate artery and vein that I pointed out several times on the last slide. And what that means is basically everything outside of that, so this stuff up in here is the cortex. Everything below that, these areas now where I'm running my pointer over, make up the medulla of the kidneys. And you'll notice right here at this junction between the cortex and the medulla, but mostly residing within the cortex, we have some microscopic structures which are known as nephrons. And the nephrons are the functional unit of the kidney because they are the structures that are actually filtering the blood and from that producing urine. Each kidney has about 1 million of these nephrons located out in its cortex that are all working together at the same time to filter the blood of the body. If you look at this picture here, I want you to follow this arcuate artery for just a minute. You'll notice that here it deviates up into the cortex, and that's because it's using these areas to bring blood actually into the nephron. So we have one nephron here on the right side. Blood is entering into that nephron right here into a structure which is known as the glomerulus. So the glomerulus is the first major part of a nephron. And basically what it is it is a ball of capillaries. It's a capillary knot. And specifically, these are fenestrated capillaries. And you may remember that fenestrated capillaries have pores in them. They tend to be more leaky. They let things filter out of them into the tissues of the body. And what happens at the glomerulus is this is where the blood is actually being filtered. So we've got these fenestrated capillaries that are located here. Blood enters into this glomerulus, all the stuff in it that's small enough to push through those fenestrations, which is basically everything except for large proteins in the blood and blood cells themselves. But everything else gets pushed into the second portion of the nephron, which is known as the renal tubule. So you'll notice kind of surrounding this glomerulus or this capillary knot, we have the renal tubule that kind of almost sits over it, like it reminds me of a Pac-Man mouth eating the glomerulus. And then there's this long twisty tube that's attached to that little Pac-Man part that sits over the glomerulus. And basically everything that gets filtered out of the blood makes its way into that little Pac-Man-like mouth and then through this kind of twisty tube that twirls around, dips down for a moment into the medulla, comes back up, becomes really twisty again, and then moves into this structure here. So everything that we're seeing that this urine is passing through is what's known as the nephron. And again, the nephron's first major component is the glomerulus. It's a capillary. And the rest of this, everything that you're seeing in tan with this twisty, curvy kind of length that we have here that straightens out, dips down into the medulla and comes back up is what's known as the renal tubule. What I want to do next is talk about the different structures of the renal tubule and give you just a little bit of information about what those different structures are for. So we're really trying to just get you familiar with the kidney today and its anatomy so that you can have a good introduction and a good understanding to the anatomy to be able to understand how the nephrons actually used to produce urine as we continue on with the urinary system. So in this next picture, what we're seeing right here is that capillary knot. So this is the glomerulus, and now that it's magnified a little bit more highly, you can see blood enters here. You get kind of this capillary ball that the blood moves through. While it's in there, things are being filtered out and pushed into the renal tubule. And then what's left of the blood exits the glomerulus through this vessel right here. So the first part of the renal tubule forms that kind of Pac-Man mouth-like structure that sits over the glomerulus and acts to collect everything that's being pushed out of the blood, everything that's being pushed out of those capillaries. And that Pac-Man-like structure, this first initial segment of the renal tubule, is what's known as the glomerular capsule. So if you look at this picture here, where I am running my pointer, this structure is the glomerular capsule, and you can see how it kind of sits over that capillary knot. We've got this hollow open space in here that allows the glomerular capsule to capture all of these things that are being filtered out of the blood or that are being pushed out of the blood at the glomerulus, at that capillary knot. I want to talk just a little bit about the structure of the glomerular capsule itself, because it's important to understanding how the blood is actually filtered. So first of all, the glomerular capsule has a couple of different layers to it. The first of these is what's known as the parietal layer. So this outer layer of the glomerular capsule that I'm running my pointer along now, that's the parietal layer. Over here on this side, you can see the parietal layer as well. But you'll notice this parietal layer right here folds over on itself. And then there's a component of it that's represented in yellow that's in direct contact with, that's actually sitting on top of the glomerulus itself. And that portion that you can see through here is what's known as the visceral layer of the glomerular capsule. I want to talk a little bit about the structure of this visceral layer of the glomerular capsule, again, because it's important to your understanding of how the kidneys work to filter the blood. So if we were to take just one little segment of this glomerulus, this capillary knot, and magnify it much more highly, what we would see is a structure that looks like this. So you can see one portion of that capillary. You can see it's fenestrated. We've got the pores that the artist is showing are built into it. But I want you to also notice that, at least in the case of this little segment of the glomerulus, we have a cell. The cell is known as a podocyte, so that means foot cell basically, for reasons that we'll talk about in a minute. But we have this podocyte, or this cell, that's basically wrapping the capillary 360 degrees like a hot dog bun. Now normally, if you look over here, what we'd see is these podocytes are absolutely covering every square inch of the capillary. I think that the artist has removed them from this area down in here and from this area up in here so that you can see this is a capillary, and specifically you can see that it's a fenestrated capillary because you can see those pores or you can see those fenestrations in the capillary that make it leaky. The reason that these podocytes are called podocytes is because if you look at the way that they come together, we've got a single cell here, and this cell is kind of coming together in this jigsaw-like pattern that almost looks like feet, or at least that's what the scientists thought when they first saw these cells sitting outside of the glomerulus under a microscope. So we have these little structures, okay, kind of this jagged edge to the cells that are known as foot processes. And in between where the foot processes come together, you can see these areas of exposed capillary. And those areas where we've got exposed capillaries are what are known as filtration slits. Basically, if you're something that's sitting in the bloodstream, if you're in the glomerulus, or if you're in the blood and you make your way into the glomerulus, you need to be small enough, first of all, to fit through these pores, but secondly, to fit through these filtration slits that are a part of the visceral layer of the glomerular capsule. And if you're small enough to fit through those two things, you're small enough to get pushed out of the blood. And as I said before, basically everything with the exception of blood cells and large proteins in the blood are small enough to fit and actually get pushed out of the blood, which means all of your water, basically all of your sugar, all of your ions, your vitamins, minerals, nutrients, those kinds of things get pushed out of the filtration slits, out of the glomerulus, and start to build up in the glomerular capsule before they drain down into further segments of the renal tubule. So we've talked a little bit about the glomerular capsule, and this visceral layer of the glomerular capsule, along with the actual wall of the capillary itself, makes up the filtration membrane, what any substance is going to have to cross to move from the blood into the renal tubule. Now that we've talked about this anatomy, what I want to do is discuss the different areas of the renal tubule itself in a little bit more detail. So here we are back to that picture of these nephrons that sit there mostly in the cortex, just at that junction between the RQA artery and vein. If you look at this picture here, we just got done talking about the glomerulus and the glomerular capsule, which is this first initial segment of the renal tubule that sits over that glomerulus. You notice that we have a tube that drains away from the glomerular capsule, and this is to allow everything that's coming out of the blood to move through here. And one of the things that you'll notice is that this tube is very twisted and convoluted. And for that reason, it's actually known as the proximal convoluted tubule. A lot of times you'll read that or just hear it as PCT. We'll give an acronym for it. So the PCT is this initial segment of the renal tubule, the segment that is proximal to the glomerular capsule. And the reason that it's so twisted and it turns and it's long and it's convoluted is because remember up here when we filtered the blood, we pushed basically everything out of the blood because it was small enough to go. So really the only things that stayed in the blood were large proteins found in the blood and also the blood cells themselves. Everything else got filtered out. Effectively, all of your water, most of your water, vitamins, minerals, things that we need to get back for the health of the body. So the reason that we have this really long, twisted, convoluted tubule here at the beginning of the renal tubule is that gives us time to get all of these things back that were initially pushed out because they were small enough to fit through the filtration membrane, but we need them back for the health of the body. So we're going to start reabsorbing here in the proximal convoluted tubule most of that stuff that was pushed out of the blood. Notice the proximal convoluted tubule eventually kind of straightens out. There's an area of it that dips down into the medulla. So again, here's that boundary between the RQA artery and vein. We've got a portion of the nephron that dips down into the medulla. That area is known as the loop of Henle. The loop of Henle has a descending limb where fluid is descending through it in this direction, and an ascending limb in which fluid is ascending through it. So that fluid, remember, is everything that got pushed out of the blood that we haven't had a chance to reabsorb yet or that we don't want to reabsorb. Notice that once the loop of Henle comes back up, that it becomes a tube that's very twisted and convoluted once again. This is what's known as the distal convoluted tubule. Again, you'll often just see the acronym for this used, the DCT. It's referred to as distal because if you were to take this entire renal tubule and straighten it out, it would be distal to the glomerulus. It's not the portion of the renal tubule, at least if you're fluid that's moving through this structure, that's closest to the glomerulus. The distal convoluted tubule eventually straightens out. You can see that here, and it feeds into this structure right here. So this structure is what's known as a collecting duct. It's going to be gathering the urine, so what was filtered out of the blood at the glomerulus and not reabsorbed, and taking that urine to internal parts of the kidney, from there into the ureters, which drain the urine to the urinary bladder so that it can be temporarily stored until you are able to urinate.